The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1994. Roy Calhoun was sitting at the kitchen table in his house in Tillamook, Oregon, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and the Coast Range rising through the window to the east, the same ridgelines he had been walking since 1963. The envelope had come in the morning mail, plain white Summit Valley timber printed in the upper left corner. He had opened it the way he opened everything carefully, without rushing, with the same patience he brought to everything in his life that mattered. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph cited operational restructuring and recent advancements in surveying technology and the company's commitment to efficiency going forward. The second paragraph thanked Roy Calhoun for 31 years of dedicated service and informed him that his final paycheck, along with 6 weeks of severance compensation, was enclosed. At the bottom of the second paragraph, there was a signature, Garrett Finch, District Manager. Roy read it once, then he read it again. Then he set it down beside his coffee cup and sat for a while looking out the window at the ridge. He was 66 years old. He had spent 31 years as a timber cruiser for Summit Valley walking ground that most people in the Pacific Northwest would never set foot on, reading soil the way other men read newspapers, locating landing sites, marking timber, doing the slow and patient work of learning what the land would and would not support before anyone brought a machine onto it. He had walked every significant ridge in Tillamook County at least twice. Some of them he had walked a dozen times across different seasons and different weather, learning how the ground changed and what that change meant for the equipment that would eventually follow. That knowledge lived in his legs. It lived in his hands. It lived in a set of field notebooks going back to 1963, 31 of them, one per year, sitting in a wooden crate in the barn. He got up from the table, he rinsed his coffee cup in the sink, he went out to the barn to split some wood. The axe was where it always was, hanging on the left wall inside the door. The splitting block was where it always was, out in the gravel drive where the light was good in the morning. Roy took the axe down, carried it outside, and began working through the pile of Douglas fir rounds he had cut 2 weekends before. The work was straightforward. You read the grain, you set the bit, you let the weight of the axe do what it was designed to do. You did not fight it. You worked with what the wood was. He split wood for an hour without thinking much about anything at all. This is important to understand about Roy Calhoun before anything else. The letter did not destroy him. It did not send him to the telephone to call a lawyer or to the truck to drive straight to the Summit Valley office and demand an explanation. He was not a man who operated that way. He had spent 31 years in the field learning that anger at the ground accomplished nothing. The ground did not care what you thought about it. The ground was what it was. You either learned to read it correctly or you paid the price, and the price was always paid in metal and time and money, and sometimes it was paid in worse things than that. Roy Calhoun had learned to read the ground correctly. He had spent 31 years doing exactly that, and whatever Garrett Finch had signed his name to on that piece of paper, the ground itself had not changed. The ridgelines through the window were the same ridgelines they had always been. The work was the work. That did not go away because someone in an office had decided it could be replaced by a machine. He stacked the split wood against the barn wall in the early afternoon and went back inside to make a sandwich. He ate standing at the counter looking out at the yard. June's rose bushes were still dormant, bare brown canes against the fence the way they always looked in early March before the warming started. June had been gone for 6 years now. He still thought about her every day, but the thinking had changed. It was less like a wound and more like a compass bearing, something that told him which direction was home. He ate his sandwich, he washed the plate, he went back to the barn and picked up the field notebook from 1963. It was thin and brown, the cover worn smooth from 31 years of sitting in a wooden crate. He opened it to the first page. His own handwriting from 1963 when he was 35 years old and had been working for Summit Valley for a matter of weeks. The handwriting was smaller then, more careful, the writing of a man who was still learning what he needed to record and what could be left out. Notes on soil texture and bearing capacity on spring locations on the way Water moved through a piece of ground when you knew how to look for it. He had been taught by a man named Wallace Pruitt, who had been cruising timber in the Coast Range since the late 1940s. Wallace was 60 years old when Roy started and had been walking the same ridges for 15 years by then. He knew every significant piece of ground in the county the way a doctor knows a patient he has treated for decades. Not from charts, from presence, from time and attention and the willingness to get down on your knees and put your hands in the dirt and ask the ground directly what it had to say. Wallace had handed Roy a 2-foot steel probe the first week on the job. It was sharpened at one end and blunt at the other. He had told Roy to carry it on every cruise to probe the ground before any landing site was approved, to never trust his eyes alone, because the ground was patient and would wait as long as it needed to wait before showing you what was underneath the surface. Roy had carried that same probe for 31 years. It was in the barn hanging on a nail above the crate of notebooks, which is where it had lived since Wallace gave it to him, and where it would continue to live for as long as Roy was alive. He closed the 1963 notebook and opened the one from 1993. The handwriting was larger now, more economical. 30 years of practice had taught him exactly what mattered and exactly how to write it down. The entries were dense with information. Soil texture at specific depths, drainage patterns, spring locations, bearing capacity estimates, and the particular entries he made when ground looked solid from the surface, but was not. He called those entries liars in his own private shorthand. Ground that lied to you. Ground that looked right and felt wrong when you pushed the probe in and felt the resistance change at 18 inches. There were 3 of those entries in the 1993 notebook, 1 in February, 1 in July, 1 in October. The October entry was for the Harlan Creek unit. He read that entry now standing in the barn with the afternoon light coming through the door. He had written it after the pre-sale cruise he had completed in early October, walking the 340-acre second growth unit on the east slope of the Coast Range, 12 miles from Tillamook. Good timber up there. 60 to 70-year-old Douglas fir, mostly straight, reasonable access from a forest road that had been in place since the 1970s. He had spent 3 days on the unit, walking every significant slope, checking drainage, identifying potential landing sites, doing the work he had been doing for 31 years. He had flagged 2 locations for the log landing and written his assessment of each one in his tally book and submitted it in his formal report to Summit Valley. Primary site he had written, north bench approximately 40 feet above the road junction, good bearing, native soil all the way down, adequate drainage, recommend for all ground-based equipment. Secondary site, do not use, subsurface drainage compromised, old fill unknown depth, will not hold wet in wet conditions. He had written that second entry in capital letters, do not use. He had put it in the formal report the same way. He had flagged the secondary site with orange flagging tape and left his notes clearly marked and submitted everything through the proper channels and considered the matter handled. Nobody had asked him about it again. He closed the 1993 notebook and set it back in the crate. He stood for a while looking at the stack of 31 notebooks. 31 years of asking the ground what it was willing to hold and writing down the answers in his own handwriting, one entry at a time. Then he went inside, put on his coat, and drove to the Summit Valley office. Garrett Finch was 34 years old and had been working in the timber industry for 3 years. Before Summit Valley, he had worked for a paper company in Oregon's Willamette Valley doing operations management. Before that, he had an MBA from a university in Portland and a background in supply chain logistics. He was intelligent, organized, genuinely committed to doing his job well and completely without the kind of experience that comes from spending years in the field on rough ground and wet weather, learning what the land will and will not support. He was in a meeting when Roy arrived at the office that Tuesday afternoon. Roy told the front desk assistant he would wait. He sat in the plastic chair beside the door for 40 minutes, watching the clock on the wall and the cars in the parking lot and the clouds moving in from the Pacific over the ridge to the west. It was going to rain before dark. It usually was in early March in Tillamook County. After 40 minutes, the assistant came back and told him that Mr. Finch was going to be tied up for the rest of the afternoon. Roy nodded. He reached into the left breast pocket of his canvas cruiser's vest and took out his tally book, the one from 1993, the one with the October entry for Harlan Creek. He opened it to the page he wanted, folded the cover back so the page was clearly visible, and set it on the counter in front of the assistant. He told her to make sure Mr. Finch saw the page he had marked, the entry about the secondary landing site on Harlan Creek, the one in capital letters. She looked at the notebook. She said she would make sure he got it. Roy thanked her. He drove home. He split the rest of the wood in the drive before dark and stacked it against the barn wall and went inside to make dinner. He did not know then, and would not know until much later, that the tally book sat in the assistant's inbox tray for the rest of that week and the week after that and the 6 weeks that followed, untouched in the ordinary shuffle of a busy office, its capital letters fading in importance, the way things do when no one is looking at them. He did not know that on the same Tuesday afternoon he had sat in the plastic chair waiting for Garrett Finch. Garrett was in the conference room signing a 12-month contract with a company called Terralogic Solutions out of Portland. He did not know any of that. He made his dinner, ate it alone at the kitchen table, washed his dishes, and went to bed. Now let me tell you about Garrett Finch and Wade Ellison, because you need to understand what happened in that conference room and why it happened the way it did. Wade Ellison was 38 years old. He worked for Terralogic Solutions, a surveying technology company based in Portland that had been in business for 4 years. He drove a company truck with the Terralogic logo on the doors and carried a demonstration kit that included a GPS receiver, a laptop loaded with terrain modeling software, and a laser rangefinder capable of measuring distances accurate to within a centimeter. His outdoor clothing was technical and clean. His boots looked like they had been purchased recently and worn mostly indoors. He was good at his job. His job was selling equipment to timber companies who wanted to believe that technology could replace the slower and more expensive business of paying experienced men to walk their ground. He had come to Summit Valley in January of 1994 with a 45-minute slide presentation. GPS terrain modeling, he explained, could identify optimal landing sites in a fraction of the time required by a timber cruiser on foot. The laser system could measure slope gradients and drainage patterns with precision no human observer could match. The software could calculate soil bearing capacity from surface topography and known geological data. It was, Wade said, the future of pre-sale planning, faster, cheaper, and more accurate than traditional methods. Garrett had asked for a demonstration. Wade spent half a day with the equipment on a unit Summit Valley had already cruised. He ran his terrain analysis and his drainage index calculations and his bearing capacity estimates. And at the end of it, he produced a site ranking that identified the primary landing location as the top scored option. It was the same location Roy had recommended. Garrett took this as confirmation that the system worked. He had no reason not to. The numbers matched. The software had done what Wade said it would do. What Garrett did not understand, and what Wade either did not know or did not say, was that Roy had identified that primary location in approximately 20 minutes on his first pass through the unit. It was obvious. Flat bench, good, drainage, direct access to the haul road. Any system, electronic or human, would have found it. You did not need 31 years of experience to find the obvious location. What you needed 31 years of experience for was everything else. The secondary location, the one that looked right from above and felt wrong when you put a probe in it at 18 inches and felt the resistance change and kept pushing and found soft gray material underneath that smelled like wood from the 1940s. That was the test, not the easy location, the one that lied. Wade's system had no mechanism for finding that. It could read the surface. It could not read what was underneath the surface. It could model topography from GPS data. It could not feel the difference between native soil and decomposed fill from a logging operation that had used that same bench as a landing site 50 years before. But Garrett did not know that yet. He was 34 years old with an MBA and 3 years in the industry. He had a line item in his operating budget for timber cruising expenses that looked, in the context of the TerraLogic proposal, very large compared to what the software cost. Wade had shown him the math. The system paid for itself in under 2 years. After that, it was pure savings. The contract was signed in February. Roy's termination letter went out in March. Now let me tell you about Roy Calhoun at 35 years old in the spring of 1963, because you cannot understand what was lost when that letter arrived without understanding what had been built. He had grown up in Douglas County in the timber country, south of the Willamette Valley, the son of a mill worker who had spent his life inside a building cutting wood someone else had harvested. Roy had spent his childhood summers outside in the hills above their property building, the habit of attention that would define his entire working life. Not the dramatic attention of hunting or adventure, but the quieter attention of observation. The way light moved through canopy at different hours, the way water followed ground in ways you could predict if you had paid enough attention to enough ground in enough seasons. He came to Summit Valley in the spring of 1963 through a job listing in the county paper. They needed a timber cruiser. He had no formal training in the field, but he had references from 2 men who had watched him work on a timber sale the previous summer and had seen something in the way he moved through ground. A steadiness, a tendency to stop and look before he moved on to probe and check and verify before he committed a mark to paper. Wallace Pruitt trained him over the first year, not in a classroom, in the field in all weather, across every kind of ground the Coast Range offered. Steep ground and ground that looked flat but was not. Wet ground and ground that changed its character between October and February in ways that made a real difference to a 40-ton machine trying to operate on it. Wallace taught him to read vegetation the way a navigator reads charts. The species composition of a 10-foot radius could tell you what was happening underground. Slightly different species mix slightly darker green, a particular grass that preferred wet ground, even when the surface looked dry. These were not dramatic signals, they were subtle. You had to earn the ability to see them. You had to spend enough seasons walking the same country, making predictions and checking them being wrong, and understanding why until the reading became automatic, until your body knew things that your mind had not consciously registered. Roy had that quality when he started. Wallace gave it a method and a language. By the end of the first year, Roy could walk across a piece of ground and tell you things about it that no instrument yet built could measure. He built on that over 31 years, year by year, unit by unit, season by season. Every significant ridge in Tillamook County walked at least twice. The difficult benches walked a dozen times in different conditions. The hidden fills from old logging shows mapped and noted and kept in the memory of those 31 notebooks. The spring locations that only revealed themselves in February. The frost depth patterns that changed bearing capacity in ways that mattered in March. In 1988, the regional manager at Summit Valley had offered Roy a step up. A field supervisor position, less walking, more oversight, more money. The job was real and the offer was genuine. Roy had sat with it for a week before saying no. He needed to be on the ground. That was what he told the regional manager, not behind a desk reviewing other people's cruise notes. On the ground with the probe in his hand, asking the ground directly. He meant it the way he meant most things, which was completely and without performance. The ground was where the work was. The work was what he knew. He was not interested in supervising other people's work from a distance when he could still do the work himself. That decision had kept his salary lower than it might have been. He had never given that much thought. June had understood. They had lived simply in the house on the edge of Tillamook and raised their son Lee and paid their bills and saved what they could. It was a life built around work that mattered done the right way, and he had never regretted it for a single day. Here's the thing about that 1988 decision that Roy never knew. When Garrett Finch arrived at Summit Valley in 1991 and began reviewing personnel costs, the number attached to Roy Calhoun's name in the budget was a number that reflected 31 years of salary increases, benefits, equipment, and mileage. It was a large number. What the budget did not show, and what no line item anywhere could show, was the dollar value of every disaster that had not happened because Roy had walked the right ground before the machines arrived. The ROI on a notebook entry that read "Do not use" was invisible until a machine went through the surface it was sitting on. Garrett had not made a cruel decision. He had made a rational one based on the information available to him, filtered through a set of assumptions about what technology could and could not do. That seemed entirely reasonable in January of 1994. If you had never spent a day in the field with a timber cruiser and had never watched a man put a probe in the ground and feel the change in resistance at 18 inches and understand immediately what that change meant for everything that was going to come after it. This is worth saying plainly because the story is not about a villain. There is no villain in the story. There is a young manager making decisions with incomplete information. There is a technology salesman selling a system that does what it is designed to do and cannot do what it was never designed to do. There is a piece of ground that has been waiting patiently since the 1940s for someone to put enough weight on it in wet conditions. And there is Roy Calhoun, 66 years old, sitting in his barn in March of 1994, reading the October entry in his 1993 tally book for the third time, knowing exactly what that bench on Harlan Creek was going to do in April when the ground was still wet from the longest rainy season in recent memory. He had done what he could. He had written the warning in capital letters. He had submitted it in his formal report. He had driven to the office the same day he received the termination letter and waited 40 minutes and left his notebook with the assistant and asked her to make sure Garrett Finch saw the page he had marked. He had done all of that. There was nothing else he could do from here except wait. The rain came that evening, moving in off the Pacific the way it did in early March, steady and purposeful, soaking into the ground it found, following the paths of least resistance down through the soil and into whatever lay beneath the surface. Roy sat at the kitchen table after dinner with a second cup of coffee and listened to it on the roof. He thought about the Harlan Creek unit. He thought about the secondary bench, the one 60 feet above the road junction, the one he had probed in October with the tile rod, feeling the firm material at 12 to 18 inches, and then the change, the sudden softness, the way the probe dropped into something that was not soil, but something that had been compressed over 50 years into the shape of soil without the integrity of soil, decomposed wood. Old fill from a 1940s logging show that had used that same bench as a landing before the current forest grew back over it. He thought about the weight of a loaded skidder. He thought about spring conditions and drainage compromised below the surface and the way the ground around a loaded machine in those conditions would behave if the wrong person put the wrong machine on the wrong site at the wrong time of year. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup. He went to bed. Outside, the rain kept coming. In the barn, 31 field notebooks sat in their wooden crate. On the nail above the crate, the tile rod hung in the dark. In the Summit Valley office, the October entry for Harlan Creek sat in the assistant's inbox tray, unread, its capital letters quiet in the dark of a closed drawer. The ground at Harlan Creek absorbed the rain without comment. The old fill from the 1940s, compressed and patient, under 18 inches of what looked like solid earth, took on water the way it had been taking on water every spring for the last 50 years. The machines were scheduled to start work on a Monday in late April, 45 days away, 45 days of rain still to come. The Feller Buncher went in on a Monday morning in the last week of April. The Coast Range had been wet all month. Not unusually wet by the standards of the Oregon coast, but wet in the sustained, patient way that the range absorbed through March and April, week after week of rain moving in off the Pacific and settling into the ground and working its way downward through the soil profile the way water always does, following the paths of least resistance, collecting in the places where drainage was compromised, pooling in the spaces where solid earth ended and something else began. Dex Halloran had been running heavy equipment in the timber industry for 8 years. He was a careful operator, not cautious in a way that slowed production, but careful in the professional sense, meaning he paid attention to what the machine told him through the seat and the controls and the way the ground responded to the weight he was putting on it. He had learned early that a machine was only as safe as the ground it was sitting on, and that the ground had a way of telling you what it thought about the situation if you were paying the right kind of attention. He drove the Feller Buncher onto the Harlan Creek bench that Monday morning and felt the ground give slightly under the tracks and noted it the way a careful operator notes things, which is to say he registered it and filed it and kept it available while he continued working. Spring moisture, he thought. The whole range had been soft this month. He made his first cuts on the far edge of the bench where the timber was densest and the ground felt firmer, and the machine moved the way a machine should move on solid ground. The work went well. The Douglas fir fell clean, the buncher processed the timber efficiently, and by mid-morning Dex had a respectable pile accumulating at the edge of the landing. By mid-afternoon he had moved closer to the center of the bench, and the sensation under the tracks had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed a less experienced operator. But the ground was softer here than it had been at the edges, and the machine settled slightly with each pass in a way that the edges had not. He radioed down to the landing. Breck Norris was 26 years old and had been working as a landing foreman for Summit Valley for 18 months. He was a capable young man, organized and reliable in the routines of his job. But 18 months in the field was 18 months. And the thing about 18 months in the field is that it is enough time to become comfortable with the procedures without being enough time to have developed the deeper instincts that procedure is supposed to protect against. He knew the survey. He knew TerraLogic had evaluated the site and ranked it number 1. He knew the equipment had been cleared. Dex told him the bench felt soft underfoot, softer toward the center than the edges. Breck told him the survey had cleared the site. Dex said he understood that. He said it still felt soft. Breck said it was probably just the spring moisture. The whole range had been wet. He told Dex to keep working and to flag it in the end-of-day report if it was still a concern. Dex kept working. This is the thing about the kind of mistake that costs $247,000. It almost never happens all at once. It happens in steps, each one small enough to seem reasonable at the time, each one narrowing the space between where you are and the thing you cannot take back. A machine that feels slightly soft underfoot is not an emergency. A landing foreman who defers to a completed survey is not being reckless. A district manager who trusts a technology company he has contracted and paid for is not being negligent. Each individual decision viewed in isolation looks defensible. The disaster is in the accumulation, in the way that each small, reasonable decision removes one more barrier between the present moment and the thing underneath the ground that has been waiting since the 1940s for someone to put enough weight on it. Tuesday passed. The Feller Buncher worked the perimeter of the bench. Wednesday morning came in gray and cold, a low ceiling over the Coast Range, with mist moving through the timber, and the John Deere 648 skidder arrived at the Harlan Creek landing just after 6 o'clock. The 648 was a substantial machine. Loaded, it weighed approximately 42,000 pounds. Dex had worked with the same model on a half dozen previous sails and knew its behavior well. It was not a delicate instrument. It was a machine designed to move heavy timber across rough ground. And it was effective at doing exactly that as long as the ground it was operating on was what it appeared to be. But the first 3 trips across the landing went without incident. The skidder moved the processed timber from the bench to the road junction. The load came off the skidder, returned. 3 trips, standard production. The morning was moving the way mornings were supposed to move on a timber sail. The 4th trip was the same. On the 5th trip, Dex brought a full load across the bench from the northeast corner, following the same path he had used on the previous runs, and the right rear wheel went through. Not gradually, all at once. One moment the machine was moving, the next moment the rear axle was buried to the differential housing and ground that had seemed firm 30 seconds before. The machine tilted sharply to the right, the front wheels leaving the surface slightly on the left side, and Dex shut it down before it could go further. He sat in the cab for a moment. Then he climbed down and walked around to the right rear and looked at what had happened. The wheel had gone through what appeared to be solid earth and was now sitting in a cavity that had opened up beneath the surface. Around the rim of the hole, the ground was cracked in a pattern radiating outward from the point of failure the way ice cracks when weight concentrates on a weak point. And in the cavity itself, visible now that the surface had broken open, was a material that was not soil. It was gray and fibrous and wet, compressed into something that resembled earth from above, but had none of the structural integrity of earth when weight came on it from above in saturated conditions. Dex knew what he was looking at. He had seen it once before in 1989 on a unit in the Tillamook State Forest, about 7 miles from where he was standing now. He had been walking the unit with a timber cruiser, an older man named Roy Calhoun, who was showing him the pre-sale work before the machines came in. Roy had brought him to a bench not unlike this one, had crouched down and pressed his hand flat against the surface, and then pushed his fingers in, and then stood up and taken a 2-foot steel probe from his vest pocket and pushed it into the ground at several points. Roy had let Dex feel it himself. The firm resistance at the top, the change at about 18 inches, the probe dropping into something soft and wet beneath. He had explained what it was, old fill. A previous logging operation, probably from the 1940s, had used this bench as a working area. They had graded it, possibly filled it with debris and cut material. And then the forest had grown back over 50 years, and the fill had compacted and settled and been covered by a layer of soil that looked and felt solid on top, but was not structurally solid when significant weight came on it in wet conditions. Roy had told him the particular smell of it, the gray fibrous material when it was exposed, the way it looked like rotting wood, because that is what it was. Rotting wood and organic debris packed down over 50 years, full of water in spring, behaving not like soil, but like a sponge under load. Standing beside the sunken skidder on the Harlan Creek bench, looking at the gray fibrous material around the buried wheel, Dex Halloran smelled that smell. He recognized it immediately and completely. He had been taught to recognize it by the man whose job had been eliminated 2 months before. He stood there for a moment with that knowledge sitting in him like a weight he had not been carrying a minute ago. Roy Calhoun had shown him this exact thing on ground not far from where he was standing 5 years earlier, had put the probe in his hands and let him feel the change in resistance at 18 inches, had explained in plain language what it meant for any machine that tried to operate on it in spring conditions. Dex had learned it. He had filed it away, and then he had climbed up into the cab of a feller buncher on a Monday morning and driven onto a bench that felt soft underfoot, and he had noted the softness and filed it away and kept working because the survey said the ground was solid. He stood there with all of that sitting in him. Then he picked up his radio and called the landing. Breck Norris came up the slope from the road junction and stood at the edge of the failed section and looked at the sunken machine and said nothing for a long moment. Then he called Garrett Finch. Garrett was in his office in Tillamook. He was reviewing production schedules for 3 other sales running simultaneously with Harlan Creek and was in the middle of a budget revision that his regional supervisor had asked for by the end of the week. He picked up the call and listened to Breck describe what had happened and what the machine looked like and the gray material around the wheel, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked if anyone was hurt. Nobody was hurt. Then he asked how bad it was. Breck told him the skidder was buried to the axle housing on the right rear. He told him the ground around the failure point was cracked and soft, and he did not think any wheeled equipment could safely approach the machine. He told him the bench was likely compromised beyond the visible damage area. Garrett told him to shut the operation down. No more equipment on the bench until he had a better picture of the situation he would call terralogic. He called Wade Ellison. Wade answered on the second ring. He was in Portland at his desk working on proposals for 2 other timber companies in the region. Garrett described what had happened. He described the location, the machine, the gray fibrous material in the cavity, the cracking surface around the failure. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Wade said that the GPS terrain data had shown solid bearing capacity on that site. The surface topography and the regional geology data had both indicated adequate support for ground-based equipment. Garrett waited. Wade said that the spring moisture conditions across the Coast Range this season had been anomalous. Extended saturation beyond normal parameters could affect bearing capacity in ways the model did not account for. Garrett said nothing. Wade said there might have been a calibration issue with the drainage index calculation. Certain site-specific drainage patterns could produce localized saturation zones that the regional data set did not capture at sufficient resolution. Garrett put his pen down. Wade said that what it sounded like based on Garrett's description was a subsurface condition that would have required manual ground verification to identify. Ground truthing. Physical soil probing, vegetation analysis, that kind of on-site manual assessment. Garrett sat with that last phrase. Ground truthing, manual soil probing, vegetation analysis, on-site manual assessment. He asked Wade what that process was called in traditional timber cruising practice. Wade said it was standard pre-sale fieldwork. A timber cruiser would walk the proposed landing sites and do manual soil probes and surface observation. Garrett said he understood. He told Wade he would call him back. He hung up and sat for a moment at his desk. The production schedule for Harlan Creek was on his desk. The budget revision was on his desk. The contract with Terralogic Solutions signed in February was in the filing cabinet behind him. And somewhere in this office was a field notebook that Roy Calhoun had left with his assistant on the day he came in after receiving his termination letter. Garrett got up and went to his assistant's desk. She was not in yet. He opened the inbox tray on the left side of her desk and looked through it. Under a stack of vendor invoices and 2 inter-office memos and a package from the regional office that had arrived the week before and not yet been opened, he found the tally book. It was a small notebook, brown cover, worn smooth. He picked it up and opened it to the page that had been folded back. His eyes went immediately to the entry Roy had written. The date was October 14th, 1993. Harlan Creek Unit, secondary landing site, bench approximately 60 feet above road junction. And then below that, in letters larger than everything else on the page, secondary site, do not use. Subsurface drainage compromised. Old fill unknown depth, will not hold wet in wet conditions. Garrett read it once. Then he read it again. Then he looked at the date on the entry and did the arithmetic in his head. October of 1993. 6 months before the machine went through the surface. 6 months of that entry sitting in capital letters in a notebook that had been in this inbox tray since the day Roy Calhoun drove to this office and waited 40 minutes and left it here. He stood at his assistant's desk for a long time. The thing about that moment, the thing Garrett Finch would carry for the rest of his career was not the money. The $247,000 was a serious number, and the consequences for his professional standing were real, and he understood both of those things clearly. But what sat in him in that moment at his assistant's desk was something different. It was the understanding of what the tally book represented and what had been discarded along with the salary that had produced it. Roy Calhoun had walked that ground in October. He had probed it. He had felt the change at 18 inches. He had recognized the gray material and understood what it meant and written it down in capital letters and submitted it in a formal report, and then driven to this office and waited 40 minutes and left the notebook here so that the information would reach the people who needed it before the machines arrived. He had done everything right. The notebook had sat in an inbox tray for 6 weeks. Garrett stood there and understood with the full weight of a man absorbing a lesson he had paid significantly for, that the $247,000 was not the cost of a technology failure. It was not the cost of anomalous spring moisture or an uncalibrated drainage index. It was the cost of a chain of small inattentions. A notebook placed in a tray and forgotten. A meeting that ran long. A foreman who trusted a survey over the sensation coming up through the seat of a machine. A manager who had never spent a day in the field with a timber cruiser and did not know what he was losing when he signed the letter. No villain. Just the accumulation. Garrett took the tally book back to his desk and sat down. He called Wade back and told him the situation was worse than a drainage calibration issue. He told him there had been a pre-sale soil assessment that had flagged the secondary site in capital letters. He told him he needed Wade on site the next morning. Then he sat for a while longer with the tally book open in front of him. Outside in the field, the skidder sat buried on the Harlan Creek bench, 42,000 pounds of machine resting in a cavity of gray, fibrous material that had been compressing slowly since the 1940s and had finally met something heavy enough, wet enough to let go. The ground had done what Roy Calhoun had written in capital letters that it would do. Now Garrett Finch had to make the phone call he had been building toward since he opened the inbox tray. He looked up Roy Calhoun's number in the personnel files. He sat with the phone in his hand for a while. He was aware that what he was about to do was ask a man he had laid off 2 months earlier to come out and help him fix a problem that would not exist if he had not laid that man off. He was aware that there was no way to ask that which did not require him to acknowledge directly or indirectly what the termination letter had cost everyone involved. He dialed. Roy answered on the third ring. He was in the barn. Garrett said his name and identified himself, and then said he needed to ask about the Harlan Creek unit. There was a silence on the line, not hostile, not surprised. The silence of a man who had been waiting for something and had just heard it arrive. Roy said that he had left his tally book with the assistant back in March. Garrett said he knew. He said he had been looking at it. He paused. He told Roy he needed him to come out to the site. Another silence, shorter. Roy said the secondary bench. It was not a question. Garrett said yes. He said the old fill had gone soft in the wet conditions. The skidder was buried to the axle housing. Roy said yes, just that, yes. The way a man confirmed something he already knew without taking any particular satisfaction from the confirmation. Garrett started to say something else, and Roy said he would come out the next morning, 6 o'clock. Then he hung up without asking about compensation, without asking for a description of the damage, without saying anything that resembled anger or recrimination or the particular sharpness of a man who has been proved right at great cost to someone who dismissed him. Garrett sat with the dead phone in his hand and felt something settle into him that he recognized from his worst professional moments. Not quite shame, something more functional than shame. The recognition that he had made a serious error in judgment, and that the error had consequences, and that he was now in the position of being helped out of those consequences by the man the error had been made against. He went home that evening and sat at his kitchen table and tried to do the math on the recovery. The machine was worth approximately $180,000 and was currently immovable by anything on site. The ground around it was too saturated and too compromised to support anything heavy enough to pull it out. The landing had to be rebuilt from scratch on a different site. The timber sale was shut down indefinitely. The crew was on standby drawing pay. Wade Ellison drove up from Portland the next morning. He arrived at the Harlan Creek unit before 8 o'clock with his Terralogic GPS unit on its tripod and his laptop open on the hood of his truck, running what he was calling a post-incident terrain analysis. The terrain model glowed on the screen in blue and green, the failed bench rendered in precise topographic lines that showed nothing of what was underneath it, the old fill invisible and irrelevant to a system that could only read what the surface told it. Garrett arrived shortly after Wade. Breck Norris was already there. Dex Halloran was standing near the machine looking at the cracking surface around the failure area, not saying much. They all stood and looked at the buried skidder for a while. The right rear wheel was completely below grade. The machine sat at a visible tilt. Around the perimeter of the failure zone, the surface had cracked in a pattern that extended outward in several directions, suggesting the soft zone was larger than the visible damage. Wade made notes on his clipboard. He took GPS readings from several points around the failure. He cross-referenced them with the terrain model on his laptop. The model showed what it had always shown: a bench with adequate slope, adequate drainage, index, adequate estimated bearing capacity from the regional geology dataset. None of what had actually happened was in the model. Garrett watched Wade work for a while. Then he said the words that had been sitting in him since the previous afternoon. He said, "Can your system explain what happened here?" Wade looked at his clipboard. He said the subsurface conditions had been outside the model's predictive range. Old fill deposits of that type were not detectable from surface topography or regional geology data. It would have required ground truthing to identify, manual soil probing, vegetation analysis, that kind of on-site manual assessment. Garrett had heard that phrase now twice in 24 hours. He said that is what Roy Calhoun did. For 31 years, Wade did not answer. They waited. Roy's green Ford pickup appeared at the bottom of the forest road at 3 minutes before 6. It was a 1979 model, the kind of truck that had been used hard for a long time and maintained well enough that the use did not show as neglect. It came up the road at the pace of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is in no hurry to arrive anywhere other than where the work is. Roy got out of the truck slowly, the way men in their middle 60s get out of trucks that have carried them over a lot of rough road. He stood at the door for a moment, looking at the failed bench from the edge of the road. His eyes moved across the surface in a pattern that had nothing random in it, not the way a man looks at something unfamiliar, the way a man reads something he has read before and is checking to see what has changed. He was wearing the canvas cruiser's vest over a wool shirt, the same vest he had worn to every timber cruise for 31 years. The left breast pocket held his current tally book. In his right hand was the tile rod, the 2-foot steel probe sharpened at one end that Wallace Pruitt had given him in 1963, and that had hung on the nail in his barn for 31 years between the work it was built for. He walked up to the landing without greeting anyone in particular. He nodded once at Garrett, briefly acknowledging the situation rather than the man. He did not look at Wade Ellison or at the Terralogic GPS unit on its tripod, or at the laptop screen glowing with its blue and green terrain model. He walked to the edge of the sunken area around the buried skidder. He crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the surface, fingers spread, holding it there for a few seconds, reading the temperature and the texture and the moisture content and the small tremors of resistance that the ground communicated to a hand that had spent enough time listening. Then he stood and walked 8 feet to the north and crouched again, then 12 feet to the west, then back toward the center. At each point, he held his hand against the ground for several seconds before standing and moving on. Dex Halloran watched this from near the machine. He had seen Roy Calhoun do this before in 1989 on the Tillamook State Forest Unit, where Roy had shown him the old fill and let him feel the probe drop into the soft layer at 18 inches. He watched Roy's hands on the ground and felt the recognition of it settle in him, the understanding that this was exactly the skill that had been present on this unit 6 months before the machine arrived and had not been present when the machine arrived. Wade Ellison watched from near his truck. At some point, he stopped taking notes on his clipboard. At some point after that, he closed the laptop. Roy took the tile rod and began probing, not randomly. He moved in a grid pattern, each probe approximately 4 feet from the last working methodically outward from the failure center, reading the resistance at each point and recording something in his tally book after each one. 18 inches of resistance and then soft. 14 inches and then soft. 22 inches in one location, nearly 3 feet of solid material in another spot at the northern edge of the bench before the soft layer began. He was building a map, not a terrain model, not a topographic rendering from GPS coordinates, a map made from direct physical engagement with the ground itself. Probe point by probe point, each entry in his tally book, a data point from the actual subsurface, from the real thing, rather than the estimated thing. It took him 45 minutes. When he was finished, he walked over to where Garrett was standing and opened the tally book to the new page of probe measurements. He had drawn a sketch map of the bench with the probe points marked and the readings noted at each point, and he had drawn a line across the sketch that separated the zone of compromised fill from the zone of solid native soil. He told Garrett where the solid ground started. He drew the line with his finger across the sketch. Everything south of that line was old fill. It ranged from 14 inches to 4 feet deep, depending on the location, and the depression in the southeast corner was where the original landing drain from the 1940s operation had been, which was why it was the deepest and the wettest point. He tapped the page. He said the primary bench, the north bench, was clean native soil all the way down. He had probed it in October. It would hold anything Summit Valley put on it. Then he reached back and opened the tally book to the October entry. He set the 2 pages side by side, the map he had drawn in October of 1993 and the map he had just drawn in May of 1994. The boundary of the soft zone was the same on both pages. Not approximately the same. The same. The fill had not shifted, the boundary had not moved. What Roy had found with his probe in October was what the machine had found with its wheel in April, described in his own handwriting 6 months before anyone put a machine on it. Garrett looked at the 2 pages for a long moment. Then he looked up at Roy. Roy closed the book without comment. He said they would need to bring in fill clean crushed rock, minimum 12 inches laid from the road edge inward. No wheeled equipment on the soft zone until the rock was down. Lay it from the edges in toward the center, not from the center outward. For the machine itself, he said they needed to excavate around the sunken wheel before attempting to pull it. If they pulled it in its current position, the stress on the axle housing would be severe and the risk of structural damage was real. Dig down to the old fill layer first, get blocking under the axle, then winch it horizontal before moving it forward. He looked at Dex Halloran. He said Dex knew what he was doing. That part would go well if they gave the machine the room it needed to come out clean. Dex nodded. He said he knew. He said he was sorry he did not catch it sooner. Roy looked at him for a moment. He said the surface looked right. That was the nature of the problem. If it looked wrong from the surface, it would not have been a problem. He said it without edge and without accusation. It was simply the truth about the ground and about the particular category of failure they were standing in the middle of. The surface had looked right. That was why the notebook entry mattered. Not because the danger was visible to anyone who looked, because it was not visible to anyone who did not probe. Then Roy told Garrett that the gravel truck needed to be ordered today. The ground was supposed to begin drying out by the weekend, and they wanted the rock laid before that happened because a partially dried surface would give a false impression of stability that would not hold under equipment weight. The sequence mattered. Garrett was writing. Behind him, Wade Ellison stood near his truck and said nothing. The GPS unit on its tripod pointed its antenna at the sky, reading the surface of the earth to within a centimeter, telling nothing about what was 18 inches beneath it. Garrett looked up from his notes. He asked Roy why he had come out here, after the letter, after everything that had happened. Roy looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, not with the heat of a man who has been wronged and is deciding whether to say so. He looked at Garrett the way a man looks at someone asking a question whose answer should be obvious, but apparently is not. He looked out at the Coast Range ridge above the unit. The Douglas fir stood in the morning fog, straight and patient, the way old timber stands when it has been left alone long enough to become what it was always going to become. He said, "The timber is here. It was not the timber's fault." He closed the tally book and put it back in the vest pocket. He picked up the tile rod from the ground where he had set it while reviewing the sketch map with Garrett. He told Garrett one more time to call the gravel supplier today, not tomorrow. Then he turned and walked back down to his pickup at the edge of the road. Nobody said anything while he walked. The machine sat in its hole. The cracked surface spread outward from the failure zone in every direction. The terrain model on the laptop screen showed a clean blue bench with adequate drainage and estimated solid bearing capacity. Roy got into the green Ford. He started the engine. He turned the truck around on the forest road and drove down toward the county road at the bottom. At the same unhurried pace he had arrived, the truck disappearing around the first bend, and then the sound of it fading until there was only the fog in the timber and the quiet particular to the Coast Range when the machines are stopped. Garrett stood on the landing and looked at what was in front of him. He looked at the machine in the ground. He looked at the cracking surface. He looked at the sketch map Roy had drawn, the 2 pages side by side in his memory. October 1993 and May 1994, the boundary of the soft zone, identical on both. He looked at Wade Ellison's GPS unit, its antenna pointed at satellites that could see the surface of the earth from 200 miles up and could not tell you one thing about what was 18 inches below the surface that Roy Calhoun had identified in October with a 2-foot steel probe and 31 years of knowing how to ask the ground what it was willing to hold. Then he called the gravel supplier. The gravel truck arrived on Friday morning. It came up the forest road in the gray light before 7, a loaded tandem axle hauling clean crushed rock from the Tillamook County aggregate yard, and the driver backed it carefully to the edge of the road junction below the Harlan Creek bench and waited for direction. Breck Norris was there. Dex Halloran was there. 2 additional crewmen from the Summit Valley yard had been sent out to assist with the placement work. Garrett Finch arrived 20 minutes after the truck, having driven out from Tillamook in the dark, with a copy of Roy Calhoun's sketch map on the seat beside him and the tally book open to the probe measurements page. He had read that page 4 times in the preceding 2 days. He had looked at the line Roy had drawn across the sketch, separating the compromised fill zone from the solid native soil. He had oriented himself to the bench and to the road and to the position of the sunken machine, and he had matched the sketch to the real ground in front of him until he understood it well enough to direct the work. The method Roy had specified was not complicated. It was precise. The rock had to go down from the road edge inward, building a stable base from the known solid ground toward the compromised zone, never getting ahead of the support beneath it. You did not bring rock in from the center and work outward, because that would mean moving the loaded truck across the soft zone before the rock was there to carry it. You worked from the firm ground out. You built the foundation before you asked anything to stand on it. This was the logic of it, and it was the same logic Roy had applied to everything he had ever done on a piece of ground. You find out what is solid. You start there. You do not ask any system to carry weight it has not been prepared to carry. The crew worked through Friday and into Saturday morning, spreading the crushed rock in a continuous layer 12 inches deep, moving methodically from the road edge toward the center of the bench, following the boundary Roy had drawn in his sketch map. The rock went down clean and firm. You could feel the difference immediately under your boots, the particular solidness of prepared ground as opposed to ground that was merely pretending. By Saturday morning, the rock base extended from the road edge to within 8 feet of the sunken skidder. Dex Halloran had spent Friday afternoon preparing for the recovery. He had brought in hand tools and a hydraulic jack from the Summit Valley Equipment Yard and had spent 2 hours carefully excavating around the sunken wheel, removing the gray fibrous material from around the axle housing by hand, working slowly and methodically, not rushing the process, understanding that the objective was to give the machine room to come out clean rather than to pull it out fast and risk structural damage that would turn a bent rim into a destroyed axle. Roy had been specific about this. Dig down to the old fill layer, get blocking under the axle, winch it horizontal before moving it forward. The sequence mattered because the physics of a buried axle housing dictated that pulling the machine in the direction it had sunk would multiply the stress on the housing rather than relieve it. You had to restore horizontal orientation first. Then you moved it forward on a path that the blocking and the rock base had prepared for it. Dex understood this. He had not needed Roy to explain the mechanics in detail. What Roy had given him was permission to take the time the job required, the professional sanction of an experienced man, confirming that the slower approach was the correct approach. In the timber industry, as in most industries, there was always pressure to move faster. The shutdown was costing money by the hour. Crew on standby, equipment idle, the sail stalled. Speed felt like the answer. It almost never was. Saturday morning, with the rock base extended to within reach of the machine, Dex brought in a cable winch and set his anchor on the solid ground at the road edge. He ran the cable to the skidder's front frame. He placed his blocking under the axle housing solid Douglas fir cants that he had cut specifically for the purpose, setting them carefully so the machine would have something to rotate against when the tension came on the cable. He worked slowly. He checked each anchor point. He confirmed the blocking was seated properly. Then he began applying tension. The machine moved, not explosively, not with drama, but steadily rotating as Roy had described the buried wheel coming up and out of the cavity as the axle housing found the blocking and used it as a fulcrum. The gray fibrous material released its hold on the rim with a sucking sound, and then the wheel was clear of the surface and the machine was sitting on its blocking above the hole it had made. Dex let the tension off the winch. He walked around the machine, checking each contact point the way a careful operator checks after a recovery, reading the machine the same way he had been taught to read the ground. Then he stopped. He was standing at the edge of the hole the wheel had left, looking down at the gray fibrous material that lined the cavity walls. The smell was there, the same smell from 1989 when Roy had brought him to a bench, not 7 miles from this one, and let him push the probe in himself. Roy had said, "Remember this smell. Remember what the material looks like, because you will see it again, and when you do, the surface will look fine, and you will need to already know what is underneath." Dex had remembered it. He had remembered it the moment he climbed down from the cab on Wednesday morning and looked at what the wheel had gone through. He had known exactly what it was and where he had learned it. He had learned it from Roy Calhoun, who was no longer employed here, whose tally book had sat in an inbox tray for 6 weeks with the warning written in capital letters, whose termination letter had been signed 2 months before the machine went through the surface he had warned about. Dex stood at the edge of the hole for a long moment, not performing anything for anyone, just standing with the understanding of it. He had carried Roy's teaching in him for 5 years and had still driven onto the bench and felt the softness and kept going because the survey said it was cleared. The knowledge had been in him and he had set it aside because a piece of paper told him to. He thought about Roy arriving at 6 in the morning without asking about pay. The way Roy had crouched and pressed his hand flat against the surface, at each point the same motion Dex had watched him make in 1989. The way the probe went in and came back out, and the reading went into the tally book point by point, building the map that the Terralogic system had not built and could not build because it did not have hands, and it did not have years, and it did not know what the smell of 50-year-old Phil meant when you exposed it from underneath. He straightened up, he went back to the winch and finished the work. By noon on Saturday, the skidder was on solid rock-covered ground at the road edge, sitting level operational, except for the bent rim that could be addressed at the equipment yard. Dex drove it onto the back of a flatbed, and it was gone from the site by early afternoon. The total time from the first call to the recovery was 9 days. The total cost when Garrett Finch finally added up the line items in his office the following week was $247,000. Machine downtime and recovery labor, the rock emplacement work for the emergency base, landing reconstruction on the north bench, crew standby pay for 9 days, lost production from the delayed sale, the bent rim repair, which was the smallest number on the list by a considerable margin, $247,000. Garrett wrote that number on a piece of paper and set it on his desk and looked at it. Then he wrote another number beside it. 31 years, then another number, 6 weeks of severance pay. He looked at the three numbers for a while. Then he put the paper in his desk drawer and called the regional supervisor to deliver the incident report he had been preparing since the machine went through the surface. The North Bench landing took the better part of the following week to construct. Garrett had a grader brought in, and Breck Norris oversaw the work according to the specifications Roy had outlined in his October presale report, the one with the primary site assessment that read, North Bench approximately 40 feet above road junction, good bearing, native soil all the way down, adequate drainage, recommend for all ground-based equipment. The grader cut the bench level, the rock base went down. The drainage was established correctly, running water off the bench in the direction the natural grade dictated rather than against it. When the landing was finished, Dex Halloran drove the replacement skidder onto it carefully on the first trip and less carefully on every trip after that, because the ground was exactly what Roy had written, that it was in October of 1993, and it held everything Summit Valley put on it without comment or complaint. The Feller Buncher went back to work on the timber. The sale ran 10 days behind schedule when all the delays were accounted for. The timber produced well. The Douglas fir came off the unit clean straight, the kind of second growth timber that the Coast Range had been building toward for 60 years. Patient and indifferent to the difficulties the humans had created for themselves on the bench below. Terralogic Solutions remained under contract for the remainder of the year. Wade Ellison's company sent a revised methodology note to Summit Valley in June, a 2-page document acknowledging that GPS terrain modeling required supplemental manual soil verification in areas with potential historic disturbance prior land use or anomalous drainage patterns. The document used the phrase ground truthing 4 times. It did not mention the Harlan Creek incident by name. It did not need to. In the small world of Pacific Northwest timber, a known story moves without needing names attached to it. It moves through break rooms and fuel stops and the company diners, where logging crews eat breakfast before first light. Moving, the way all true stories move in close industries, which is slowly and by word of mouth, and with the particular staying power of a story that instructs even as it entertains. By the end of that summer, anyone in the Oregon timber industry who wanted to know about a technology company's landing site system and a buried skidder and a timber cruiser who had written the warning in capital letters 6 months in advance could find out the broad strokes without much effort. The story was not told with malice. It was not told as an attack on anyone. It was told the way cautionary stories get told in industries where the consequences of ignoring experience show up as metal in the ground and dollars on a balance sheet. It was told because it was useful, because the lesson it carried was worth carrying forward. In June of 1994, approximately 6 weeks after Roy Calhoun had driven down the Harlan Creek Forest Road for the last time that spring, Garrett Finch called him again. Not about a crisis, about a contract. The call was different from the April call in every way. Garrett had prepared for it carefully. He had thought about what he wanted to say and how to say it and what he was actually asking for, which was substantial. And he had decided the only way to ask for it was directly without softening the context in ways that would insult the intelligence of the man he was calling. Roy answered on the third ring. He was in the barn, the same place he had been the morning Garrett called in April. Garrett said his name. He said he was calling about a consulting arrangement, not a staff position. Per unit, not salaried. He wanted Roy to pre-cruise any site where the Terralogic system flagged anomalous drainage patterns, or where Summit Valley planned to put a landing on a bench with any history of prior use or any surface indicators of subsurface irregularity. He said he understood that Roy had no obligation to consider this given the circumstances of his termination. He said he also understood that the pay structure he was proposing was less than what Roy had earned as a full-time cruiser, and that the arrangement would not include benefits. He said he was asking because there was no one else who could do what Roy did, and because the Harlan Creek unit had demonstrated that clearly enough that he was not prepared to pretend otherwise. Roy was quiet on the line for a moment. He said he would think about it. 2 days later, he called back and said yes. He never explained what he had thought about in those 2 days. He did not discuss the termination or the severance or the 6-week payment for 31 years. He did not ask for an apology or an acknowledgement of anything beyond the terms of the consulting arrangement, which were straightforward and which he accepted without modification. He simply said yes. He would do the work that needed doing. He would walk the ground that needed walking and write down what it said and let the machines follow when the ground was ready. That was the arrangement. It suited him. The consulting work suited him in a particular way that the full-time position had not suited him toward the end. There was a clarity to it. He went where the ground needed reading. He read it, he wrote it down, he went home. There was no administrative overhead, no meetings, no budget conversations. There was the ground and the probe and the tally book and the particular satisfaction of doing a thing correctly that had real consequences if done incorrectly. He worked for Summit Valley on that basis for 9 years. During those 9 years, he walked dozens of units across Tillamook County and the surrounding range, flagging primary landing sites, marking the liars writing the capital letter warnings that protected the machines and the men who ran them from the particular category of disaster that no terrain model could prevent. Every cruise went into a tally book. Every tally book went into the wooden crate in the barn when it was full. He worked alone the way he had always worked. He moved through the ground at the pace the ground required, which was slower than any system and more thorough than any system and more reliable than any system when the question involved what was underneath the surface rather than what the surface looked like from above. His knees began to fail him in the early years of the new century. Not suddenly, but in the gradual way that decades of steep ground accumulate in the joints of a man who has asked a great deal of his body and received a great deal in return. He adapted his methods as long as adaptation was possible. He took longer on the steep sections. He used a walking staff on the approaches he would have managed without one 10 years before. He adjusted without complaint because the adjustment was simply the ground asking him to be more careful on the descents. And Roy Calhoun had never had difficulty paying attention to what the ground was telling him. In the fall of 2003, on a unit in the northern part of the county, on a slope steeper than the work had required. In recent years, Roy stopped at the crest of a ridge and looked down the approach he would have taken without thinking 10 years before, and understood that he could not take it safely anymore. Not because the slope had changed, because his knees had changed in ways that were now beyond compensation. He sat on a log at the ridge crest for a while. He looked at the slope and the timber and the gray sky over the coast range and the drainage running down through the unit in the pattern he had already read from the topographic map before he left the truck. He knew what was down there. He knew where the good ground was and where the liars were and where the landing should go. He wrote it all down from where he was sitting. Then he walked back to his truck by the long way, following the ridge rather than the slope, the route that his knees would accept. He drove back to Tillamook and submitted his notes to Summit Valley with an additional note attached, explaining that the cruise for this unit was his last, that the terrain had moved beyond what he could safely navigate. He did not wait for a response. He called Garrett Finch that evening and told him the same thing directly. Garrett said he understood. He said he was sorry to hear it. Roy said there was nothing to be sorry about. He said he had known for 2 seasons that the steep ground was becoming something he needed to be more careful about, and he had been careful, and now the careful thing was to stop. He said he would miss the work. He said he did not expect that feeling to resolve anytime soon. He thanked Garrett for the 9 years of consulting work. Garrett started to say something in return, and Roy said goodnight and hung up. He was 75 years old. He spent the 9 years that followed in Tillamook. Lee came by regularly. They split wood together in the falls and fished the Wilson River in the summers and ate dinner together most Sunday evenings. Roy read. He kept a garden. He walked the flat ground near the house when his knees permitted and sat on the porch looking at the coast range when they did not. He did not walk the ridge country again. He did not need to. It was in the notebooks. Everything he had learned from every significant piece of ground in Tillamook County for 31 years of full cruising and 9 years of consulting. 40 years of asking the ground what it was willing to hold and writing down the answers was in those notebooks in the crate in the barn, 1 year per book, 40 of them by the time he stopped. June had been gone since 2006. The rose bushes on the fence were still there, tended now by Roy himself, who had learned what June knew about the pruning schedule and the soil amendments and the particular variety of patience that roses required if you wanted them to give you what they were capable of giving. He was not a natural gardener. He had become a competent one. It was the same process he had applied to everything in his life that mattered, which was sustained attention over sufficient time until the thing revealed what it had to say. He died in the spring of 2012. He was 84 years old. The end was not sudden, but it was not prolonged, and Lee was with him in the house in Tillamook when it came. The funeral was at the Methodist Church on 3rd Street, a white building set back from the road with a gravel parking lot and a stand of mature Douglas fir along the east side that Roy had walked past for 41 years. The service was held on a Thursday morning in April, which was the same month the Harlan Creek machine had gone through the surface 18 years before, though no one organized the timing that way. It was simply when the timing fell. Lee spoke. He talked about his father the way a son talks about a man he has watched work for most of his life and has understood gradually across years rather than all at once. He talked about the field notebooks in the crate in the barn. He talked about the tile rod on the nail above the crate. He talked about the canvas cruiser's vest that had hung on the hook by the barn door for as long as he could remember. He talked about the way his father moved through the ground, the particular unhurried pace of a man who was not walking to arrive somewhere, but walking to learn something. He said his father had told him once that the difference between a good timber cruiser and an adequate one was not what they knew about soil science or drainage patterns or bearing capacity calculations. It was how long they were willing to stay on a piece of ground before they made up their mind about it. The adequate ones made up their minds quickly because the answers they were looking for were on the surface, and the surface usually looked fine. The good ones stayed until the ground showed them what was underneath, which required a different kind of patience. The patience of someone who understood that what you could not see was often more important than what you could. There were perhaps 80 people in the church, timber workers, some of them now retired men who had worked in the Coast Range during the same decades Roy had walked it, and who had known him the way men in close industries know the people whose work intersects with theirs. A few people from the county neighbors, the man who ran the feed store where Roy had bought his supplies for decades, Lee's family, and in the second to last row near the back of the church on the left side, Garrett Finch. He was 52 years old now, regional manager for a larger timber company based in Portland, a man who had built a significant career across 2 decades in the Pacific Northwest timber industry. He had driven down from Portland that morning, leaving before 5 to make the service on time, and had sat in the back of the church because he was not sure of his place among the people who had known Roy Calhoun as a neighbor or a friend or a father. He had known Roy Calhoun as the man who had taught him the most important lesson of his professional life. He sat through the service and listened to Lee talk about his father, and looked at the canvas vest on the table near the front of the church and the tile rod Lee had brought in and set beside the vest, and thought about the morning on the Harlan Creek bench when Roy had walked the failed landing with his probe and his tally book and built a map from direct contact with the ground that no instrument on the planet could have produced. He had thought about that morning many times in the 18 years since it happened, not with guilt, though guilt had been part of the early years, with something closer to instruction, the kind of thinking you do when a lesson has cost you enough that you have no interest in paying for it again. After the service, standing in the gravel parking lot under the Douglas fir in the April light, Garrett waited until the crowd around Lee had thinned before he walked over. Lee was Roy's son in the physical sense that mattered: the same broad hands, the same way of standing still without restlessness, the same quality of attention in his face when he was listening. He had worked as a timber faller for 20 years before his back had ended that work, and he carried the specific wear of that career in his posture and his movement, the careful way he turned and the measured pace of a man who had learned to conserve what he had. Garrett introduced himself. He said he had worked with Roy from 1994 until Roy had stopped the consulting work in 2003. Lee said he knew the name. Garrett said he wanted Lee to know something. He said he owed Roy Calhoun more than he could adequately express standing in a parking lot, but that he wanted to try. He said that in 1994, he had made a series of decisions that had cost his company $247,000 and had nearly cost a machine operator something considerably worse, and that Roy Calhoun had come out to the site and fixed the problem without being asked, and without making Garrett feel any worse about it than he already did, which was saying something because Garrett had felt very bad about it indeed. He said he had been asking the ground correctly for the last 18 years, or at least hiring people who knew how to ask it correctly, and that the habit had started on a bench at Harlan Creek when he watched a 66-year-old man read a piece of ground the way other people read books. Lee listened to this. He nodded slowly, the way he had nodded through the service, with the patience of someone receiving information he is not surprised by, but is nonetheless glad to have confirmed in words. He said his father had never mentioned the Harlan Creek incident at home. Not once. Not the machine, not the loss, not the termination letter, not the 6 weeks of severance, not the 31 years. Not any of it. Garrett said he was not entirely surprised by that. Lee said the only time it had come up was once, several years after 1994, when Lee had asked his father directly why he had gone back to help after what had happened, after the letter, after the way it had ended. He said his father had looked at him for a moment and then said the timber did not fire me. That was all he said. Then he had changed the subject and they had never discussed it again. Garrett stood with that for a long moment. The timber did not fire me. The particular precision of it, the way it separated the work from the institutional relationship, the ground from the organization that had decided it could be replaced, the thing that mattered from the thing that had failed, to understand what mattered. Roy had not gone back for Summit Valley or for Garrett Finch or for any accommodation he was owed. He had gone back because the timber was there and the work was there, and those things had nothing to do with the letter. He asked Lee if he still had the field notebooks. Lee said they were in the barn, all 40 of them in the wooden crate, the same place they had always been. He said a researcher from a forestry school in Corvallis had contacted him about donating them to the university's archive, a researcher studying historic land use patterns in the Coast Range, who had heard about the notebooks through someone in the timber industry and had understood their value as a primary source document. Garrett asked what Lee had decided. Lee said he had let the researcher make photocopies of what he needed, but the originals were staying in Tillamook. He said his father's handwriting belonged in this county, that the notebooks were part of this specific piece of ground written about it and from it, and that moving them 200 miles to an archive felt like taking something out of the soil it had grown in. He asked if Garrett wanted to see the one notebook he kept separate from the others. They drove out to Lee's property in 2 trucks, following the familiar route through the Tillamook flatland toward the hills, the Coast Range visible through the windshield in the April afternoon. Lee's workshop was behind the house, a working space with a concrete floor and good light and the smell of sawdust and machine oil that workshops carry when they are used regularly and maintained carefully. On the shelf above the main workbench, between a can of linseed oil and a worn copy of a timber cruising reference manual that had belonged to Roy, was a single brown notebook, its cover worn smooth, the way all 40 of them were worn smooth. Lee took it down and handed it to Garrett. It was the 1993 tally book. Garrett opened it to the page Lee indicated the October entry for Harlan Creek. The ink had faded slightly in the 19 years since Roy had written it, but the letters were clear. The entry about the primary site, the North Bench, native soil, good bearing. And below it in the letters that were larger than everything else on the page, the entry that had been in an inbox tray for 6 weeks while the rain came down on the Coast Range and the old fill absorbed it and waited. Secondary site, do not use. Subsurface drainage compromised. Old fill, unknown depth. Will not hold wet in wet conditions. He turned the page. Below the October entry in smaller writing, 2 lines Roy had added later, not in October. The handwriting was the same, but the pen had been different, slightly different ink weight, the notation added on a different day. A date, May 1994, and below the date 4 words, came back, same as before. No record of the termination letter, no record of the severance, no record of 31 years ended with a polite paragraph about operational restructuring and advancements in surveying technology. No told you so, no bitterness, no claim on the significance of having been right at the cost of $247,000 to the company that had dismissed him. Just the date and the 4 words, and then on the next page, a different unit on a different ridge with nothing to do with Harlan Creek at all. Garrett stood in the workshop holding the notebook for a while. Lee said nothing. He understood that some moments required silence. Garrett drove back to Portland that afternoon. The route took him through the hills at the edge of the Coast Range, the same ridgelines Roy had been walking since 1963, visible through the truck window in the fading April light. He thought about the 4 words for most of the drive, the compression of them, the economy of a man who had never used more words than the work required. He had come back. The ground was the same as before. That was the complete record of everything that had happened. Everything else, the letter, the machine, the $247,000, the 9 years of consulting work, the lesson that had cost Garrett Finch more than he wanted to think about, none of that needed to be in the notebook because none of it was about the ground. The ground had said what it was going to say. It had said it in October of 1993 to a man who knew how to listen. Someone had finally listened in May of 1994 after the machine went through the surface, and the ground had said the same thing again because the ground does not change its answer based on what you needed to hear when you needed to hear it. In the barn in Tillamook, the wooden crate held 40 tally books, one per year, 1963 through 2003. 40 years of asking the Coast Range what it was willing to hold and writing down what it said. The tile rod hung on the nail above the crate, the same nail it had hung on since Wallace Pruitt placed it in Roy Calhoun's hand in the spring of 1963. 2 feet of steel sharpened at one end and blunt at the other. No electronics, no satellite connection, no software, no calibration issues, and no post-incident methodology revisions. An instrument for asking the ground a direct question reliable in exact proportion to the knowledge and patience of the person holding it. Lee kept the 1993 notebook on the shelf above his workbench, not as a memorial exactly, more as a compass bearing. The October entry in capital letters and the 4 words from May of 1994, both in his father's handwriting, both still legible, both available to anyone who came into the workshop and took the notebook off the shelf and opened it to the right page. Roy Calhoun had told Lee in the last years of his life, sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the light leave the Coast Range, that the thing he most wanted Lee to understand about the work was not the technical part. The technical part could be learned. Wallace Pruitt had taught it to him. He had passed versions of it to Dex Halloran and to other operators and foremen across 40 years of working in the same country. The technical part was learnable by anyone willing to spend enough time in the field. What was harder to teach was the patience, the willingness to stay on a piece of ground until it showed you what was actually there rather than what you expected or hoped or needed to find. The capacity to slow down enough to receive what the ground had to communicate, which was never dramatic and never urgent, and always quiet, and always available to whoever was paying the right kind of attention. The ground does not lie, Roy had said. People lie. Instruments make mistakes. The ground just is what it is. All you have to do is ask it correctly. That was enough for Roy Calhoun. It is enough for this story too.